questions grew louder than the answers. She began to reflect not just on Cosby, but on herself, on the instinct to defend, on the hesitation to doubt, on the role she may have played, however unintentionally, in reinforcing silence. "It's not just about what you say," she explained. "It's about what you choose not to hear." That realization changed everything. Rashad didn't suddenly claim to have all the answers. She didn't position herself as someone who could define the full truth of what happened. Instead, she embraced uncertainty and with it, responsibility. Because what she could no longer deny was this: the voices of the women mattered. Not as headlines, not as controversy, but as human experiences that deserved acknowledgement. "I wish," she said quietly, "I had listened differently sooner." That sentence carried more weight than anything else she had spoken. IT wasn't dramatic. It wasn't offensive. IT was honest. As the conversation around her remarks continued to unfold, reactions were mixed. Some praised her for finally speaking with nuance and reflection. Others questioned why it had taken so long. A few remained critical, arguing that words now could not undo the impact of past dismissals. Rashad didn't respond to every reaction. She didn't try to control the narrative. Instead, she stepped back, allowing her words to stand on their own. Because for her, this wasn't about public approval. IT was about personal truth in a later appearance. When asked directly if she regretted her past offense of Cosby, she paused. Not out of hesitation, but out of care. "Regret is a complicated thing," she said, "but growth requires you to face where you stood and why." She didn't erase her past. She confronted it. And in doing so, she offered something rare, not perfection, but accountability. As time passed, one thing became clear. Rashad's story wasn't just about Bill Cosby. IT was about what happens when admiration collides with truth, when loyalty is tested by reality, when silence is no longer sustainable, and perhaps most importantly, it was about the courage to change, even when that change comes late and comes at a cost, because in the end, the darkest truths aren't always the ones we uncover about others sometimes. They're the ones we uncover about ourselves. Her words didn't erase the past, but they reframed Ida as she neared the end of her speech. There was a sense of release. Not relief exactly, but resolution. A quiet acceptance that truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is necessary. "I am not here to rewrite history," she said. "I am here to face it." When she stepped away from the microphone, the silence lingered for a moment longer. Then slowly, the audience rose, not in celebration, but in recognition of the courage it took to speak after so many years. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about what was hidden, but about what is finally revealed in the years that followed. The conversation surrounding Phylicia Rashad didn't disappear. It transformed. What had once been a single moment of revelation evolved into something more enduring, a legacy of reflection. She no longer needed a stage to be heard. Her silence had become just as powerful as her words. Students she mentored, young actors stepping into an industry she had helped shape, began to notice the difference. Rashad was still poised, still commanding, but there was a new dimension to her guidance. She spoke less about success and more about awareness, less about opportunity and more about responsibility. "Talent will open doors," she told them once. "But character decides what you do when those doors lead somewhere difficult." It was clear she wasn't speaking in hypotheticals. Her experiences, particularly those connected to Bill Cosby, had reshaped the way she viewed influence, loyalty, and power. And she wanted the next generation to understand something she had learned the hard way. Proximity to greatness does not guarantee truth. That lesson lingered, because for decades, Cosby had represented more than just entertainment. He had symbolized progress, success, and cultural pride. To question him had once felt, to many, like questioning that progress itself. Rashad understood that better than most, which is why her shift carried so much weight in private conversations. She began to speak more openly about the pressure to protect legacies, especially those that hold deep cultural significance. She acknowledged how difficult it can be to separate the impact of someone's work from the reality of their actions. "It's not easy," she admitted. "When something has meant so much to so many, you want to believe it was built on something solid." But belief, she had learned, is not the same as truth. That distinction became central to her message as the cultural landscape continued to evolve, with more voices speaking out, more stories being told, Rashad found herself in a unique position. She was both a witness to a past era and a participant in a changing one, and she chose not to resist that change. Instead, she leaned into it, not loudly, not performatively, but with intention. There were moments when interviewers tried to draw her back into controversy, asking for definitive statements, for clear-cut judgments, for something that could be reduced to a headline. She rarely gave them that, because by now, she understood that complexity doesn't fit neatly into sound bites. People want certainty, she said once. But life, especially human behavior, doesn't always offer that. What she did offer was perspective. She spoke about listening, not just hearing, but truly absorbing what others are saying, even when it challenges your beliefs. She spoke about accountability, not as punishment, but as acknowledgement. And she spoke about growth, not as a destination, but as an ongoing process. These weren't abstract ideas. They were lived experiences, and perhaps that's why they resonated. Over time, the narrative around Rashad began to shift, no longer defined solely by her past offense or her later reflections. She came to represent something more nuanced, the possibility of change, even after certainty is hardened. Not everyone accepted that. Some still viewed her through the lens of her earlier statements. Others felt her later words didn't go far enough. And some, quietly, saw in her journey a reflection of their own struggles, moments where they, too, had chosen comfort over questioning. Rashad didn't try to control those interpretations. She let them exist, because she had reached a place where being understood by everyone was no longer the goal. Being honest was, I am one of her final public talks on the subject. She shared a thought that seemed to encapsulate everything she had come to understand. We are all capable of being wrong. The lights in the theater dimmed slowly, and a quiet hush fell over the audience as Phylicia Rashad stepped onto the stage. At 77, her presence still carried the same grace and authority that had once made her a household name. For decades, she had been admired as a symbol of dignity, strength, and elegance, especially for her role as Clair Huxtable on The Cosby Show. But tonight felt different. There was a weight in the air, something unspoken yet deeply felt. For years, Rashad had stood by Bill Cosby, the man who had helped shape her career and redefine black family representation on television. Together, they had created something groundbreaking, an image of success, love, and unity that resonated across generations. To millions, they weren't just actors. They were family. But behind the scenes, time had layered truth with silence as she began to speak. Her voice was calm, but there was a subtle tremor beneath it. She didn't rush her words. She chose them carefully, as though each one carried years of thought, conflict, and reflection. There are moments in life, she said, when what you believe and what you learn no longer align. The audience leaned in. For decades, Rashad had defended Cosby publicly. She had once dismissed the growing accusations against him, calling them orchestrated attacks. At the time, her loyalty seemed unwavering. Many admired her for it. Others criticized her, but no one truly knew what she carried privately. Tonight, that began to change. She spoke about the early years, the laughter on set, the sense of purpose, the pride in portraying a successful black family at a time when such representation was rare. She described Cosby not just as a colleague, but as a mentor, someone who had a vision that reshaped television history. There was brilliance, she admitted. There was undeniable impact. But then, her tone shifted. With time, she continued, you begin to hear more, to see more, and to question what you once accepted without hesitation. She didn't sensationalize. She didn't dramatize. Instead, she spoke with the quiet gravity of someone who had spent years wrestling with difficult truths. Rashad acknowledged the complexity of standing beside someone accused of such serious wrongdoing. She reflected on the internal conflict, the tension between personal experience and the testimonies of others. It wasn't easy, she said, to reconcile the man she knew with the man described in courtrooms and headlines. There is a difference, she said softly, between the person you know and the full truth of who someone may be. The room was silent. She didn't claim to know everything. She didn't present herself as a judge. Instead, she spoke about responsibility, about listening, about growth, and about the courage it takes to reassess long-held beliefs. At some point, she said, silence becomes its own kind of answer, and I realized I could no longer stay in that silence. For Rashad, this wasn't about condemnation. It was about clarity, about acknowledging that the legacy of the Cosby Show could coexist with darker, more complicated reality, about understanding that admiration does not excuse accountability. She spoke about the women who came forward, their voices, once dismissed, now impossible to ignore. She admitted that, in the past, she hadn't fully listened, that she had allowed loyalty to overshadow curiosity and doubt to overshadow empathy, that, she said, is something I carry with me. There was no applause. Not yet. This wasn't performance. It was a reckoning. She reflected on what it means to be part of something larger than yourself, how the show had inspired millions, uplifted communities, and changed perceptions, but also how its legacy had been shaken by the actions of the man at its center. It's possible, she said, for something beautiful to come from something deeply flawed. The applause faded slowly, but the atmosphere never quite returned to normal. Something had shifted, subtle but undeniable. Phylicia Rashad stood still for a moment after stepping away from the microphone, as if absorbing the weight of what she had just released into the world. At 77, she wasn't chasing headlines. She wasn't seeking validation. This was something deeper, something personal that in the days that followed. Her words echoed far beyond that theater. Clips of her speech spread rapidly. Headlines formed. Debates reignited. For many, Rashad had long been seen as one of the most loyal defenders of Bill Cosby. Her past statements, firm, unwavering, were now being placed side by side with her latest reflections. The contrast was impossible to ignore. But for Rashad, this wasn't contradiction. IT was evolution. Friends and colleagues began to quietly share that this moment had been years in the making, that behind her public composure, there had been long periods of introspection, moments where certainty began to fracture, replaced by difficult questions she could no longer avoid. She had spent decades navigating an industry built on image, loyalty, and power. And in that world, speaking out, especially against someone as influential as Cosby, was never simple. There are consequences, she would later say in a smaller, more intimate conversation, not just professionally, but personally. And she meant it. Because what the public often forgets is that Rashad and Cosby's connection wasn't just professional. It was deeply intertwined with shared legacy. Together, they had created something that reshaped how black families were portrayed on television. The Cosby Show wasn't just a hit. It was a cultural shift. T.O. questioned Cosby was, in many ways, to question apart her own history. That was a conflict. For years, she had held on to her personal experiences, memories of kindness, mentorship, and creative collaboration. In her world, Cosby had been supportive, focused, even protective of the show's message and its impact. That version of him felt real to her, but so did the growing chorus of voices telling a very different story. At first, she admitted, it felt impossible to reconcile those two realities. That tension became a quiet burden. She spoke about moments when she would read testimonies, account from women whose stories were detailed, emotional, and consistent, stories that didn't align with the man she thought she knew. And each time, she found herself at a crossroads, dismiss, defend, or truly listen. Listening, she realized, required letting go of certainty, and that wasn't easy. There's a comfort in believing you understand someone, she said. Letting that go feels like losing something. But over time, she said, the question is, what do we do when we realize it? The room was still, not because the question was difficult, but because the answer was. For Rashad, the answer had been reflection, a willingness to revisit her beliefs, a decision to listen more deeply, and the courage to speak, not perfectly, not definitively, but truthfully as she stepped away from the spotlight in later years. There was no grand conclusion to her story, no final statement that tied everything together, just a quiet, enduring presence. Because in the end, her journey wasn't about rewriting the past or redefining Bill Cosby. IT was about something far more universal. What it means to confront uncomfortable truths, that T.O. accept that admiration can coexist with disappointment. T.O. understand that silence, even when well-intentioned, can carry consequences. And to realize that growth doesn't erase who we were, it reveals who we choose to become. And maybe that's the most powerful truth of all. As the years moved quietly forward, Phylicia Rashad became something she had never quite intended to be, a symbol not just of grace and success, but of reckoning. Not the loud, dramatic kind that dominates headlines, but the quiet, internal kind that reshapes a person from within. There were no more grand speeches, no more defining moments under bright lights. Instead, her story continued in smaller spaces, classrooms, rehearsal halls. Private conversations where the cameras were absent, but the truth felt closer. Those who worked with her during this time often describe a shift that was difficult to put into words. It wasn't visible in her posture or her voice, but in her pauses, in the way she listened longer before responding, in the way she asked questions instead of offering conclusions. Because certainty, once lost, had been replaced by something more careful, more honest. She began encouraging her students to challenge not just the roles they played, but the systems around them, to question authority, even when that authority came wrapped in admiration, to understand that influence, no matter how positive it appears, should never be immune from scrutiny. Power, she told them one afternoon, isn't just about what someone gives you. It's about what they're allowed to take without question. The room had gone still. Many of them knew exactly what she was referring to, even without names being spoken, because the shadow of Bill Cosby still lingered, not just in public memory, but in the deeper conversations about accountability, legacy, and truth. And yet, Rashad never reduced her experience to a single narrative. She resisted the simplicity that others often sought, because she knew firsthand that people are rarely just one thing, that someone can create something meaningful and still be capable of causing harm. That admiration, when left unexamined, can become a barrier to truth. These weren't easy ideas to sit with, but she didn't try to make them easier. Instead, she let them exist as they were, complicated, uncomfortable, and real. In one particularly quiet moment after rehearsal, a young actress approached her with a question